Hello, everyone. This is the 135th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview freelance football writer and author Mr. Gavin MacPhee discussing his book, Connecting the Continent: The Birth of the European Cup and Football's Golden Age, that came out last year. This book covers every season of the Champions Cup from its inception in 1955 until 1969. Welcome, Gavin.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, my name's Gavin MacPhee. I'm from a small town in the northeast of Scotland. And, just grew up as a kind of typical Scottish boy into football and always playing, watching, and particularly reading about it. That's pretty much the only thing I ever read about was football and football books and newspapers. Kind of, once I got to that realization that I was never going to make it as a player, I always wanted to be a sports writer. And I first started kind of doing some reporting when I was about 16 on a local kind of the Highland League. It's a local league in Scotland, like a fourth tier. And then I went to university at Liverpool John Moores and studied like one of the few kind of football specific courses in the UK at the time. It was called Science in Football, which was really interesting course. And from there, I kind of got into coaching and came over here to the US and worked kind of summer camps and then youth soccer programs, and was always writing about football and doing little blogs and things like that. So decided to give it a go during the pandemic to write my first book.
Let's look at the European Cup. It's been a constant in our lives for almost 70 years now. So, what prompted you to write about this topic?
I've always loved it. I grew up in a house where we didn't have satellite television. So, the games that were on, the live football that was on was either Italian football or FA Cup or Scottish Cup matches or Champions League matches. So, I mean, I was born in 85, so there was around for the European Cup, but I don't remember much of it before the kind of rebrand. And I just loved, I mean, I have a vivid memory of coming, into my house from like a camp or something, an evening football training, I think it was, and seeing Stoichkov scoring for Barca against Man United, I think in
94,
94.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And just, that size of that stadium, the noise from the crowd, this kit manufacturer, Kappa, that we'd never heard of, and all that kind of element to it was just kind of really amazing. So I know there's a lot of nostalgia for the European Cup, and I think I've probably got caught up in it too. But I actually loved it, certainly those era of the Champions League as well. So that's what I was initially planning on writing about, was the Champions League, and maybe one day I'll get there. But as you start to kind of think about the origins of that kind of restructure, you start going back into the 80s and some of the scenarios there. Steaua Bucharest winning it, Real Madrid and Napoli playing in the first round or whatever. And then you start to kind of think, well, why are these clubs the big clubs? And it just ended up thinking, well, you really got to go back to the beginning. And that's kind of what I decided to do. And I felt that crucial part of the kind of scope, and one day I'd love to write about at least the whole of the European Cup, if not the Champions League as well. It was essential to start there. And I'm obviously over here. I knew that it would be difficult for me to kind of interview a lot of people. And so, there's a lot of resources that I could write this book via books and online things as well. So it was a good opportunity to do that. So that was definitely a help in choosing the topic. And I think the last thing was there's a lot of niche books out there, I think, that kind of maybe just really concentrate on a small time period. And I wanted to kind of maybe just do something a little bit bigger in scope. And it sets the table, I think, for the future of modern football.
What was the research process like to gather so much information for these early years of the competition? I imagine there must be in-depth analysis in so many languages about the matches and events in question, and that probably requires a different type of research.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. I think technology has 100% helped. I think even 10 years ago, a lot of the things I was able to get access to might not have been there. But, the starting point for me was kind of general histories of, there is a few books about the European Cup out there and European football. And that kind of would give me like a good overview of the competition of the season in question. Even something like Wikipedia, where I could just kind of map out the kind of the bracket and who won. And then, you might pick up a little game. Oh, that looks like that was an interesting one. Let me go and delve into that a little bit more. So from those general kind of histories, you also get, club histories, player biographies. There's some great like almanac type books. The International Football Book was one I found. There's a Real Madrid book of football that was published in the early 60s in the UK, which was like a treasure trove of information. So I did a lot of that kind of, digging around in World of Books and those kind of places, aid books. And then there's the newspapers, which are really helpful. There are some countries that have amazing archives that translate within it. The Netherlands, particular, La Stampa in Italy. There's a couple in Spain as well. And obviously the British, ones that I had easier access to. So that was really good. You'd, be able to get match reports. You'd even, get build up before the game. You could see what the coaches were thinking, the feedback from the draws, those kind of things. And then there's also interviews with players, past and present, that you might be able to dig out and find them. And then I suppose magazines, obviously World Soccer. I know you have, I think you have every edition. Yeah, I mean, so I have quite a few from the 60s that I was able to get off of. It's 1960 it started, I think.
1960, yeah.
Yeah,
October 1960, I think, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I was able to get a few of them in that period, and that was really helpful. There's a really good magazine that the UEFA has, like the Champions magazine they released for a while. So that would usually have like some kind of throwback kind of article in them. And then academia was actually, I found that it's a kind of world that you don't really think of, almost as a separate kind of universe, but there was some great academic work on the origins of UEFA and kind of European football and being able to get some of those papers and those kind of compilation books. And then, the last thing I said would be those kind of websites like yourselves, on YouTube where you can see games. There's a great one, LFC in Europe, I think it's called, which basically has a page on every single game Liverpool's played in Europe. And
Oh, I've
so,
seen that. Yeah,
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 it's
yeah.
yeah. So, you get these kind of spots that are really just fantastic resources for this kind of research. So it was a lot of fun. It was trying to find those little nuggets that, oh, that happened there. Let me add that in. And that was really the exciting part.
Let's go back to the beginning. In your book, you discuss how the Mitropa Cup was a precursor to the modern European Cups. Can you present this competition for people who may not be aware of it?
This was a competition that came out in the late 1920s. And this was a kind of period, I think, where a lot of the stuff that maybe eventually happened later was really kind of formulated. Obviously, we have the World Cup begins in 1930. So this is developed by Hugo Meisel, who's a lot of people might be aware of, Austrian coach and administrator. His brother, actually, Willie Meisel, wrote Soccer Revolution. It's a kind of famous book in the 50s. And this is, I think, the first consistent inter-nation club competition. And it ran from August to November alongside the league season. So a lot of kind of similarities to what's going to happen with the European Cup. Home and away legs. And it's originally Hungarian, Czech, Austrian, and Yugoslavian teams, I think, to begin with. And then Italian teams get in pretty soon after. And this is a period where I think at that time you've got British football, which is still at a high level in its own kind of little isolated world. You've got the Rio Platense of Argentina and Uruguay. And then you've really got the Central European, the Danubian school that is probably, the third kind of pillar of football. A really high level. I mean, I think Italy and Hungary and Italy and the Czechs, that's two of the World Cup finals in the 30s. So the players that are playing in this, you've got Sindelar, Miazza, Orsi, MTK, Budapest, Inter, Juventus, Austria, Vienna, all these kind of big teams of the time. And so absolutely this was I think definitely a precursor to the European Cup.
Do you think the Second World War delayed the inception of the European Cup?
I think the only potential challenge there is maybe the kind of the travel. I'm not an expert in aviation, but I think it was obviously like it would have been getting there anyway, right? But definitely, I think it was probably on its way. And it may well have been this competition that it was. It was already expanding into other countries, and it may well have just gradually kind of gone into Spain and France and the like. But obviously, the World War II football kind of, I don't think it shut down everywhere, but it pretty much did. Moving around Europe was obviously very difficult. So many players involved in the military, and you had some of these kind of nation states were broken up and all sorts of structures were removed and stuff. So it clearly had a huge impact, I think, on the potential of a pan-European club competition.
We have often heard the story of how the French magazine L'Equipe's, the editor of L'Equipe, Gabriel Ano, he proposed this project. Can you walk us through how this process started with a certain friendly match in England?
I think in terms of Hano, so I think he'd been advocating for this competition for a kind of a few years. He was a player himself for France and even the coach of the national team. But as we've said, a lot of these things, the war and the logistics might have got in the way. So the game you're referring to is Wolves versus Honved, and Wolves have been playing a series of floodlit friendlies. So I think they just installed these floodlights, which is another kind of technological advance, which is just kind of kicking in around this time. And they'd installed these floodlights, and they were having all these touring teams come into play. This was, I think, quite a common thing at the time. The most famous one in the UK prior to that was Moscow Dynamo coming, I think, in the 40s. So they played 3 games. I think Racing of Argentina was one of them. Spartak Moscow might have been another. But the final game is against Honved. And this is December of 1954. And the second half was broadcast live on TV actually in the UK. So there's obviously a lot of history here. The Hungarians are well known to the English following the games in 53, and then obviously the World Cup in 54. And this is, the preeminent football nation in the world at the time, you would have said. And after about 15 minutes, I think they're 2-0 up. And there's a lot of kind of talk that, Wolves, I think, water the pitch at halftime. Quickly becomes a lot harder for Honved to kind of play their slick passing game. And eventually Wolves come back and 2 late goals to win it after they got a penalty just after half time. So the English media really kind of go crazy for this. They're basically saying this proves English football is the best. I think it's the Daily Mail, I think, that has the headline, Arise Wolves, champions of the world, I believe is the term. And I think that's what really sets Arno off, who's a spectator at the game. He writes an article in L'Equipe. I don't want to give you my worst French, but it's pretty much no, Wolves are not champions of the world, but L'Equipe is going to set up a competition to decide this once and for all. And so, the remarkable thing is, over the course of that winter, they really decide to set it in stone. There's Hano, there's a guy called Jacques Ferran, and I think it's Jacques de Rijswijk is the other one, or
Right,
I
right.
could be pronouncing their names incorrectly, and they map out the competition and they get a lot of these clubs. They reach out to a lot of the big clubs. Santiago Bernabeu is on the committee. Sebes from Hungary is another one. And each week they're writing updates in the newspaper about this. So they keep the momentum going, they keep it in the public eye. I think L'Equipe, now it seems quite surprising that a newspaper would be kind of maybe coming up with a competition this important, but I think they were very much involved in the Tour de France, and I think the French at that time were great administrators. The Olympics came through them, the World Cup, of course, as well. So they brought it to FIFA's attention a couple of times, but they didn't really kind of want to endorse it. And eventually they kind of did a draw. And an important thing to note here, I think, is not all these teams were champions. They were organizing this tournament a lot of the time based on the best team in the nation, but leagues were still going on at this time when they were doing the draw. So they weren't able to kind of confirm that all these teams were champions, which is why you have some teams like Hibernian from Scotland. I'm an Aberdeen supporter. It should have been Aberdeen actually, who should have been in the tournament. But eventually it got so close to happening, and UEFA had to and FIFA had to get involved, and they basically said UEFA would take over the running of it, and following the first season it would be the champions of each country. But absolutely, those were the guys who really drove the project and made it happen.
Similarly, we have heard about the initial reticence of the English clubs regarding this project.
This is pretty famous. I think England had, and they still have this situation where the governing body of the Football Association is obviously separate to the Football League. So it would be the FA would be interacting with UEFA and FIFA if they were, and we obviously know that they were somewhat isolationist as well in terms of those governing bodies. But Chelsea were the team that was invited and they had won the league. And their secretary was a guy called Joe Mears, but he was also the secretary of the Football League at the time. And there's an infamous gentleman called Alan Hardaker, who was very much an isolationist. He saw these midweek matches as a threat to the Football League. He was concerned that these friendlies were taking too much attention away from the league. And they very much, I think there's a quote that it took them 10 minutes. They just did not think that this was a serious competition and it would be a potentially down the line a threat to their own competition, and that English teams did not need to enter this. This was kind of during this time where they came up with the idea of the League Cup, which is obviously England has quite rare having two cup competitions, and the league. But that never even got off the ground until like the mid-60s. But I think that was that was his kind of response to this. So it seems that Chelsea were kind of encouraged not to participate and they chose to decline their spot. And I think it went to Djurgårdens of Sweden, who took their spot.
Can you discuss the format of this competition in the early going?
The basic premise is it's almost hasn't changed in terms of if you think of the Champions League now and you have the round of 16 onwards, that's pretty much what the European Cup was in those days. Very simple, home and away. Away goals did not come in for a number of years, so you'd have a third game quite often, toss of the coin if still tied after 3 games. There was no kind of set days and times for games. Clubs just had to arrange them by a specific deadline, at least in the first few years. There was some years where there was a little, maybe the first round was seeded, but varies from year to year. But generally, it was an open draw. And, especially in those early days, you had kind of like the first round and then you were into the quarters. There were always more than 16 teams, but it was a while before they got to 32 from there. So, and then obviously a final, a neutral location.
And it's significant that, as you mentioned, the general format really didn't alter until, I guess, maybe 35 years later with this new Champions League, the seeding, etc. So for a long time, the format was generally the same year after year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And I think, this just the simplicity of it. It's just a really kind of clear competition. You win your league, you get your chance at glory. That's really your big qualification element is your entire season beforehand and the option to win the league. And it's just really easy to follow. There's so much jeopardy involved. It was knockout football, but you also kind of get that second chance. There is a little room for error. And whether good or bad, you can take them back to your place and or if you need to you can get a famous win away from home. But these teams, at some point I was going to try and do some statistics, but the home teams were very successful, so everyone kind of felt they had a chance, I think, despite who you were playing, that you could get your crowd behind you and have a famous result at home. So I think, yeah, I mean, it was just it's a great competition. Even the Champions League now, really, it only gets interesting. Well, obviously we've got this new format, so we'll wait and see. But traditionally, it really only get interesting in the last decade, I would say, until the knockout stages, right? So I think that's part of it.
No club is more synonymous with this competition than Real Madrid. In fact, the whole legend of the club and its emblematic star, Alfredo Di Stefano, is due to this competition's early years. Why do you think Real Madrid really took to this competition? Was it just due to the vision of the legendary club president Santiago Bernabeu?
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely think he was a visionary, absolutely, and I think the fact that they had this huge stadium was testament to that. At that time, they were one of the bigger clubs in Spain, but they certainly weren't the club that we know them as now. They were getting nothing like the attendances that the stadium that they built was capable of having. And so I think he saw this opportunity as a chance to make his mark outside of Spain, to really develop his club's brand there. And I think in some years it was their only chance of success as well. So once they won the first one, I think it really kind of became synonymous with who they were. There's a kind of an exhibition element to the club at that time. There's so many times when Real Madrid have turned up, and if people, you pull these newspaper articles out, they'll be playing in all sorts of different places and testimonials, and so they had a pretty hectic schedule, but they definitely kind of saw themselves as ambassadors, I think, for Spain as well. And it was really hard for teams to win at their stadium. It's just got to that point where I think, as they still do now, I don't know if anyone necessarily thinks that they've been the best team in Europe over the last decade, but it's hard to say otherwise in terms of the trophies that they've accumulated. And there was definitely an element of that potentially at that time. I think, but Atletico Madrid 1-1, Athletic Bilbao 1-1, Barca, I think 1-1 during that period. So, but I think a lot of it all starts with Bernabeu. It starts with him taking over the club, him building the stadium, and obviously him getting to Stefano, which was key. And I know there's a lot of more qualified people than me who've talked about the potential kind of help that they may have got during that period, but I think he was a huge element of that also.
Were there any doubts on the feasibility of this competition in these early years, or did the legend of Real Madrid take care of that?
As far as I could see, once it was off the ground and once it was happening, I think it made such a big impression on the countries and the teams that were involved, that everyone really bought into it. And then, you have obviously Rams that get to the final. Milan, I think, losing the semis in 56, right? And then, the English join the year after. And I think after that, there wasn't really any way back. It was established.
What do you think was a reference point in terms of like this cup was here to stay?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could vary from country to country, and maybe I'm looking at this, from a UK lens, but I would say there was still an element there where the English especially kind of gave a seal of approval to things. Their entry and run to the semis in 57, the Busby Babes, and the fact that Man United play Real Madrid in that semi-final, I think that really added legitimacy, and it basically said everyone's in now. And obviously, we may come on to it later. There were still the Soviets and that weren't kind of fully bought in, but you really had, by this point, all the major footballing countries in Europe at that time were playing in this competition. So, I mean, it sounds quick, but I think by the first couple of seasons, it really had established itself as that kind of that pyramid, the top of the pyramid for all of club football in Europe.
These early years were marred by the tragedy of Manchester United in 1958. Did that in any way affect the competition?
I think it definitely created a legacy for United and for Busby. I'm sure that some teams were kind of maybe more precautious with their air travel and their kind of scheduling from there. I think it didn't seem to have any negative connotations in terms of people not entering the competition or pulling out. And you could see why retrospectively maybe that might have happened, but that didn't really seem to do it. If anything, it kind of added this layer of the quest for certainly Manchester United and teams in England to try and win it. But I think it was just one of those kind of sad events that definitely is probably the most significant event of the early part of the competition. But there was clearly enough passion for the tournament that it remained a big part of European football.
Did the Cold War politics of the day affect this competition in the early years?
As I just mentioned there, the Soviets, they didn't enter until I think 1966, I think. And this is a time when they won the European Championships. Is it?
60, yes, 60.
So they're obviously a strong footballing nation at that time. I think that initially the biggest impact was the players. So we have in 56, we have the Hungarian uprising. The European Cup is directly involved in that because Honved are playing Athletic Bilbao in a European Cup, I think, quarter final. And that leads to Shibor, Koshkis, and Puskas They end up defecting to the West during that period, and all three of those would have a major impact in the tournament, along with Kubala, who came a little bit earlier. And then later on in 68, 69, there's a boycott based on the Prague Spring, and that kind of results in all the kind of Warsaw Pact countries refusing to play. So there was definitely those kind of broader issues, and I think from game to game, tie to tie, there's all these kind of different stories of teams traveling through into different crossing checkpoints and such. And but I would say one of the kind of most amazing things is that this was such a kind of divided kind of time as far as I'm aware, politically and culturally, and yet football just seems to kind of, there was none of that football. East German teams were playing West German teams hypothetically, and Russian teams were playing eventually Spanish teams and such like. So it's quite amazing how it kind of cut through all that.
The 1960 final in Glasgow is often referenced as the zenith of this great Real Madrid side, with Puskás and Di Stefano sharing the 7 goals in their win over Eintracht Frankfurt. Was this, in a way, another reference point in terms of the dominance of the competition?
Absolutely. I think it's their crowning glory, right? 5 in a row. No one else has done that since. I think it's the fact, such an amazing scoreline as well when we look back at it. I think I make a point in the book that we've obviously seen some high scorelines in football in recent years as well. So it kind of does kind of get tend to lumped into, oh, that's a kind of crazy scoreline from back in the day. But as we've seen in recent years, that's not uncommon, right? We've had World Cup semi-finals and Champions League quarterfinals with such high scores. It's the record attendance. I think obviously I'm Scottish. It's a huge kind of cultural event in Scotland too, that this team came and played such an amazing style. I'm sure it probably had an impact in West Germany also with Eintracht Frankfurt. This is a time before the German league is even professionalized. I think you have this amazing story of, this is 50% of all the hat tricks in European Cup finals are scored in this game, and it's two of the greatest players of all time both score a hat trick. That's just quite remarkable. But I think it's a kind of a shorthand for their entire period of domination. It's like Brazil in 1970. It's perhaps an end of an era. And I think definitely not at the time, but definitely as you look back, this was clearly, the big reference point that kind of that initial era of the competition had ended. But I think, I mentioned earlier they were doing all these tours and stuff, and there was clearly like an element, I think, of they put on a show. The only game I think maybe I can compare to my lifetime is maybe, Barcelona in the 2011 final, where there was just kind of perhaps a clear recognition that this was a team at its peak and performing on the biggest stage at the highest level.
As we come to the 1960s, Benfica comes to the fore and the legend of Eusebio is born. At a time when perhaps Barcelona could have picked up the mantle from Real Madrid. How significant was the Benfica dominance that also later included 3 more finals in this decade?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, Barcelona, they looked like they would be the ones. They knocked out Madrid in the first round, actually, after the final. Herrera had been sacked. They'd lost the semi-final, actually, in 1960. But they'd started to take over in Spain. You could argue domestically they were as strong as Real Madrid. I think they had 4 La Ligas each. So in terms of significant from Barcelona, it was huge because they weren't back in the competition, I think, for about 15 years. And this was, I think, a big shock when Benfica beat them. You mentioned Eusebio. I didn't realize either, he didn't actually play in this final. He had just
No,
joined,
no, he joined, plays in the second one, yeah, the
right,
next year.
exactly. Yeah. He had just joined. There'd been a bit, I think he was ongoing dispute with Sporting and whether he's been playing for their feeder club in Mozambique as well. But so this was kind of Mario Coluna as the star of this team, I think. You've got, I think, what I would kind of maybe consider, maybe after kind of Herbert Chapman, you've got we're talking about the first super coach here in Bela Gutmann. And, that's such an amazing story. And it was really enjoyable, in the book to put together these kind of pen portraits of these guys. But you have his experience, prior to the war with this influential Hungarian school we mentioned, and then he goes to Brazil, and according to him, he invents the 4-2-4. So this is just marvelous team that I think still very attacking, and obviously we'll come on to how potentially that kind of changes. But I think a bit more structured, tactically compared to kind of maybe Madrid. Amazing to think that they had four African-born players in this team in '61: Santana, Aguas, and Costa Pereira, and Coluna. I think a couple of them may have been kind of sons of colonial landowners or whatever, but still born in Africa. And I don't think that's repeated until Chelsea in 2013 maybe. So I think that's a really nice element to it as well. But I mean, their run is quite remarkable, and I think you could probably make the argument that they were maybe the team of the '60s. They perhaps should have won at least one more. I think, and that final is, after the one before, this is another, you have an amazing run of finals, 60, 61, and 62, and this is an amazing game, 3-2, and some amazing goals in that game as well. So yeah, definitely. I think it was a massive, significant moment that this team from a small country had beaten. Well, they didn't actually beat Real Madrid this year, but they did the year after. They really kind of established themselves as A, the best team in Europe, and B, with the best player in Europe.
The Latin domination continued, but this time it was synonymous with the Catenaccio tactic. Nereo Rocco's AC Milan in 1963 and Helenio Herrera's Inter in 1964 and 65 defeated Benfica and Real Madrid in those years' finals. How did this era of Italian domination advance the growth of the competition?
I think it definitely gave the tournament kind of more sophistication in many ways, and I think this is something I'm not sure I was totally able to express it in the book, but how this European competition increased the level of play across the whole continent. I think it increased the standards of play because you're exposed to these other nations. You have the Wolves coach Stan Koulis actually saying how to win in Europe requires a different way of playing, and he wasn't willing to adapt to it. And this probably becomes more pronounced with the away goals, but I think the Italian approach and the adjustment of space on the field really forced teams to have to be clever in how they possess the ball. As I said, I think Benfica probably started this, but this is kind of where I think modern football, you can see the pitch, it starts to represent games that we seen a lot more now. I think some of those finals prior to this and games prior to this, there's just players are all over the field. And you think there's going to be the defensive line, and then suddenly another defender appears or another attacker or whatever. There's definitely an element of kind of the bogeyman, I think, particularly with Inter, this idea that maybe not everything was completely fair, that winning was all that mattered to them. And I think if Real Madrid were like the aspirational team to topple, Inter was the one that everyone wanted to kind of knock off their perch. There's also a kind of, I think, a cultural legacy that's been established there that maybe perhaps negates the quality of the players of that team. It probably had two of the most creative midfielders of the decade in Rivera at Milan and Suarez in Inter. You have Facchetti, this amazing kind of attacking left back, and really Inter, it's such an interesting team to watch how they played and how they did things. And I think at the time it must have been a cultural shock, but as you look at it now, you think that's actually like a really well organized team that plays really great on the transition, and it's a kind of asymmetrical formation and all these kind of modern things that they're doing then. So, but I think in terms of the competition, it really kind of it forced everyone to kind of up their level a little bit and really kind of it gave them another target to try and defeat.
Real Madrid won their sixth and incredibly their last until 1998 to stamp their dominance of this trophy, as well as end the Latin dominance in 1966. How was this Real Madrid victory different than the ones of Di Stefano?
It's quite remarkable actually because we mentioned there 64 they're in the final against Inter, and Di Stefano's still playing. It's kind of like his last hurrah. Within 2 years they're back, but it's a very different team. It's a young Spanish team. Gento's obviously still there, and Puskás even I think plays in a couple of the early rounds. But the Galactico era is gone. We have Amancio and Piri, great players in their own right, well known I think in Spain, but not necessarily at the level, or definitely not at the level of these other guys. I think Spain had a ban on foreign players as well, and there's less kind of repatriation or citizenship given like there was to Stefano and Puskas. I think Sanchez is obviously, you just mentioned 98 there. I think it's his son, right?
Oh yeah, Manuel
That lifts
Sanchez, yeah.
lifts the trophy in 98, right?
Yeah.
So that's quite amazing too. But I think if for modern readers, this is more like a team of kind of Raúls and Gutis and Ivan Helgueras that win this competition this year. And probably the big game there was they beat Inter in the San Siro. I think they might have drawn the first leg in the Bernabeu, and then they go to the San Siro and win it, or at least it was a narrow win. And that's really the crucial game. Because Inter were going for three in a row at that time. And then they probably would have expected to beat Manchester United in the final, but they lost the semi to Partizan Belgrade. I think that's quite an amazing story too. They were the first Eastern European team to reach the final, and that's a game that easily could have gone either way. And that's a story kind of we don't really hear too much about that game. And the goal scorer for them is Vasovic, who will
Future Ajax player, yes.
exactly he'll get a European Cup, but just not with them.
What do you think Latin teams were dominant in the first decade of the competition?
Well, one of the things we didn't actually mention earlier there was the Latin Cup, which was another tournament that kind of sprung up in the 50s before the European Cup, which was Spain, Italy, Portugal, I think maybe France was involved too. So those teams were playing each other in that regard. So I think maybe that had an element. Real Madrid had their stadium and revenues from touring, and I think really just the concentration of talent was one element, right? They didn't necessarily have the restrictions on wages that some of the other countries did. Germany was obviously, if you think of the nations that are big now, Germany was coming out of the war. They didn't have professionalism until the early 60s. Similar, with the Dutch, the French, I think, have never really been quite at the level of these other countries either. So I think definitely they were able to attract a high level of player, particularly from South America. And I think tactically they were a bit more advanced and a bit more professional. We've seen some of these stories of the Inter players locked in hotel rooms before games, and their diets were perhaps a lot better. And just I think in general their football culture was probably a bit more advanced than the rest of Europe at the time.
The year 1967 is another reference point as finally a British team wins the competition. As the Scottish champions Celtic Glasgow of Jock Stein entered immortality by becoming the Lisbon Lions and defeating the favored Inter side of Herrera. How historic was this achievement?
Well, I think it was huge at the time, and probably only really gets bigger as you look back on it. I think if you were perhaps of a blue persuasion in Glasgow, you could maybe make the argument that the teams they played in the way at the final were perhaps not as strong as some of the others. And maybe they got into it at a good time. I think just lost the Italian league and Suarez wasn't able to play, but no one else in Britain had gotten to the final before. And for me, what was really amazing was watching the game back. It really was remarkable that this was a European Cup final. And given everything that we just talked about how Inter were the benchmark, the bogeyman, Celtic, Steen says before the game, we're just going to attack them. And I think there was a real conviction and belief at that time that there was a right way to play and a right way to do things, as well as representing them, their city and their culture and Scotland and maybe the UK. I think they were representing kind of a way of playing football too. Inter go ahead early on with the penalty, but after that, it's total kind of domination. The goals don't come immediately, but when they do, it's definitely deserved. I think the other thing, and obviously we just mentioned Real Madrid with an all Spanish team, but it's quite remarkable. The makeup of this team is largely, I think, 10 out of the 11 players are from Glasgow or within 10, 15 miles of the stadium. And I think only obviously Steaua Bucharest do it, I think, in 86, but there's a different kind of set of circumstances that led to that also. So I think that's quite remarkable as well. It's perhaps the end of that Catenaccio period, or at least an interlude as kind of attacking football, or at least the first punch, I think, thrown in that little war.
The following year was another important year as there was an English winner. Manchester United of Matt Busby. Now, this team included the Holy Trinity, rebuilt after a decade following the Munich tragedy. And this match was won at Wembley against the great Benfica side of Eusebio 4-1. Can you discuss this triumph and its significance?
Well, I think there's a lot of amazing stories in this period, and there's so many little subplots, but this probably might well be the biggest. The fact that Busby and I don't know if guilt is the right words, but I think there's definitely a sense of duty to him, to those players that died in Munich. Wouldn't talk about it, but he really drove through that participation in the competition after we talked about Chelsea. It was really Busby that pushed Manchester United into competing in 57 against the wishes of the league. And I think obviously the tragedy happens. And so he rebuilds his team and he's back in the competition. And within 8 years, they destroy Benfica in 66, the first team to win in the Stadium of Light. They got Dennis Law, who's the Ballon d'Or winner in 64, and then Charlton, who would go on to win it in 66. And then this young lad from Belfast called George Best. And then obviously they go to Belgrade and they play in the same stadium that the place that the Babes had their last game, and they lose. And so you've got 2 years minimum before you can ever get back into that competition. And I think Busby is a broken man after that defeat in 66. But they come back, they win the league in 67. They get to the semi-finals. They're 3-1 down on the night in the Bernabeu, 3-2 on aggregate. And they come back, and the guy who gets a critical goal is Bill Foulkes, who was a survivor of Munich. So there's just so much symmetry there. And then obviously they're in the final, and it looks like they've got it won, and Benfica equalised late on, and so nearly win it with Eusebio. I think the great save from Alex Stepney. So I think it was a huge kind of story there, that this arc of Busby, and obviously he retires soon after. So I mean, the significance there. I think of that you talk about cultural moments there in for different countries. I think that is a huge one for the history of English football and England as a country as well. I would say a cultural landmark.
So we come to the end of the decade of the 1960s. This decade ended with the returning Nereo Rocco and his star Gianni Rivera once again winning the trophy by defeating the Dutch rising force of Ajax of the young Johan Cruyff and manager Rinus Michels. What stood out from this win?
Yeah, I mean, Rocco's another one who we talk about coaches, and I didn't really know all that much about him, but he's clearly a very impressive guy too. And he wins the cup in 63, and I think he made a promise to the director of Torino. So he joins Torino after that, and then eventually comes back, he assembles a Scudetto winning team, wins the Cup Winners' Cup, and then gets into this tournament. And they had an impressive run as well. They beat Celtic. I think that was one of the early away goals victories. They were 0-0 in the San Siro, and then they win 1-0 at Celtic Park. And then they beat United in the semis. And so they get there and they play this young Ajax team who are kind of still, they'd made their mark in 65, maybe, or 67, when they beat Liverpool
Oh,
anyway.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, 5-1, right?
The match in the fog.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I think you read the books, Cruyff, I think Barry Hilshoff is one I quote in the book. They admit that when they got to that final, that it would probably came a couple of years too soon for them. So you kind of have this team on the way up, and this team probably kind of on the way down. But the team with the more experience, they just have too much for them on the night. I think Rivera is outstanding in that game, and obviously we have the last hat trick in a European Cup
Oh,
final.
yes,
Yeah,
Pierino
from
Prati, yeah.
Tati, yeah, exactly. So only one of three men to get a hat trick in the European Cup final, and Ajax get it back to 2-1, and they do have some good moments, but Milan are just too clinical and too ruthless. And it's Vasovic again who scores, I think, in this one, and he loses again the European Cup.
Did this 1969 competition, in a way, act as a bridge to the next decade of the 70s with the growth and the emergence of total football?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely you can definitely see this as a potential line in the sand, right? I mean, it's a Dutch team that wins the next year, and I think obviously Feyenoord clearly take inspiration from Ajax's ability to get to the final. Even like I know it's not covered in the book, but even like the coverage of that win, it was seen like they beat Celtic, and Celtic obviously 3 years earlier are seen as kind of forward thinking, attacking football, and they're after the Feyenoord game, it's like they're playing like this is a totally new modern way of playing. It's definitely Celtic's already outdated, but it's the last kind of big effort from the Latin teams. They don't go missing, but they don't win it again until 85, Juventus. And I think it's easy to kind of make the snap judgments, but I think the standards of football in Germany and England, and obviously we have this amazing kind of set of circumstances in Amsterdam where you have one of the greatest players of all time and one of the greatest coaches, and just this way of playing. And clearly, Feyenoord were very innovative too. And I'm not totally kind of sure why it all kind of happened, but Northern Europe definitely gets a hold of the competition after this. So I think definitely 69 is the changing of the guard. It's the last act of the old era before we enter the new one.
Let's look at the balance of this first decade and a half of the competition. Why do you think this competition captured the psyche of the continent?
I think if you go back to the very minimum, if you go back to the start and the guys from L'Equipe, it's really just the essence of kind of sport and competition. It removes doubt and conjecture. You'll always have, like we said about Real Madrid, you'll always have people, making a case for one team or the other, but you can really kind of settle this debate. It just makes things official. This is the best team in Europe. You win this competition. I think kind of why I called this book Connecting the Continent is it really kind of UEFA's just formed in 53, I believe. So you really have this Europe of football that is created here, this kind of connection, especially post-war. Again, there's people far better qualified for me, but the fact that these major countries were fighting each other 10 or 15 years earlier, I said it earlier, you have this world of diplomatic tensions. It just cuts through all that. And I think really just the glamour that seeing these teams coming from different places, exotic names. It's not like now where we know every single person and every single team, or we can if we want to. Your only chance to see them might be in the flesh. So I think
Yeah, it was truly a meeting of different styles from nation to nation.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you were going there and seeing something totally different and just really just an amazing, amazing kind of period, I think, for people who were learning more about European football.
At what point did this competition become important to clubs in terms of economics, whereby in some cases qualifying and advancing was a financial necessity?
I don't know if in this area that was the case. Maybe a Real Madrid where you've got this big stadium and you have to kind of keep this kind of hamster wheel rolling and you need that money to kind of get your next star. And obviously TV is not a big deal at this time or not really, you don't have the TV deals that we have now, which is the bulk of clubs' revenue. So if you can sell at the Bernabeu an extra 3 or 4 times a season, that was surely a big help. I think really this is almost like the reason that this was not essential for economics is probably the reason that what Berlusconi was complaining about in the late 80s, that this had so much potential to be so critical that I mean I would say it's probably a more recent phenomenon that this has become so essential for clubs because you could be out after one game and obviously if you budgeted for more than one then you might be in a bit of trouble if you draw Real Madrid in the first round.
In retrospect, what were the technological hindrances of this time regarding the establishment and or coverage of the competition?
Well, probably the obvious one is flying. Again, it's an early stage of kind of general aviation, and obviously we have the Munich disaster we talked about, and Superga wasn't too many years beforehand either. I think so for general coverage and equipment and broadcasting and journalism, that was probably a bit of a challenge. Floodlights, we mentioned there in the Wolves game. We think this tournament is totally synonymous with games under the lights, but a lot of these teams didn't have floodlights. I think Manchester United played their first European Cup game at Main Road because they don't have them at Old Trafford. And there's some games that are played in the early afternoon and such like. I don't know if it kind of improves immediately, but pitch technology, obviously, there was no winter break at this time. So you have some of these games being played in the middle of winter, and Real Madrid play Red Star or Partizan. I can't quite remember one, but the field is pretty much all ice. There's some of these games in complete mud. So I think definitely that was a hindrance in terms of the quality of the competition, but not necessarily the coverage, perhaps.
This competition started out at a time when television coverage was in its early stages, but by the end of the 1960s, it was essentially the television age. What can you say about this evolution?
Yeah, as you say, the coverage in the early days is very sparse. You know, I don't know if you have it, but it's really hard to get. I've never been able to find the broadcast of the first final. There's clips of the goals and such, but that was is really difficult. There's the Eurovision network, which the guys who set up the singing competition, they start broadcasting games, and I think there's a big one when Real Madrid play Nice and the cup they broadcast that on the network and it's very successful. But there's no like central TV deal or anything like that. There's limited channels even to broadcast matches on. I think the UK might have only had one or two at the time. I'm sure that was the case elsewhere in Europe. The quality is quite poor as well in the early days, but it grows. And obviously, super excited when I found a color version of the '69 final. It's kind of hard not to see this kind of color as another kind of evil, dividing line in the history of the game. But definitely, I think it exposes more people to these players who they might just have read about before or heard about on the radio, or even see them. And lucky if you're lucky enough to see them in the flesh. Now you can see a Rivera or even a Di Stefano play, and I think that would have been an inspiration for a lot of young kids around Europe.
Earlier, we touched up on Catenaccio. What can you say about broader evolution of tactics in this competition in this period?
Yeah, I've tried to allude to that some of that, and I think it's easy to make general assumptions on tactics. It's really interesting. There's a lot of discussions that teams were having in those days that are similar to what they were having now. And there's this kind of, I mentioned before, definitely there's a looseness, certainly a looser nature around that Real Madrid kind of team in terms of kind of how they played. But generally, I would say through the '60s, you see the balance shift from the star players to kind of team play. And not that you don't need them, obviously, as we can see in the '70s, obviously the two dominant teams have arguably the best two European players of all time in Cruyff and Beckenbauer. But in simple terms, we kind of go from these kind of or at least how they're illustrated on paper, and they're kind of hard to kind of understand when you're watching them. But these kind of 2-3-5 systems, there's definitely kind of an adjustment to like the back four during this period, or that kind of structure. The kind of we go from kind of less players up front. And there's definitely kind of some of these roles that they had. There's definitely, I always thought he was the center forward who scored every goal. And then you realize that he's everywhere. But Real Madrid kind of can't play like that and get away with it later in the '60s. And I think just there's a bit more discipline on the field. I think the first major adjustment, as we talked about with Catenaccio, is that they make the field smaller by conceding the space in front of you. And then obviously we get to the '70s and they start to concede the space behind you and the pressure, the lines of pressure. And then obviously between those extremes you find the balance. But I think it's one of the most interesting kind of tactical periods in football. And obviously I think there's some great books that really go into depth during that period. But we definitely touch on it in some elements of the book.
The European Cup also started around the same time as the Ballon d'Or, France football's Ballon d'Or competition. And it's important to point out that this competition may have been a pathway to win the Ballon d'Or. I mean, surely players such as Di Stefano in 1957 and 59, Eusebio in 65, perhaps, George Best in 1968, and Rivera in 1969 were crowned as a result. Was this a reflection of the impact of the competition?
I think definitely, whether it's completely or a major factor, certainly George Best in 68, 100%. I think, this is the guy who played for Northern Ireland, so he doesn't necessarily have the same, international kind of legacy as some of the others. Rivera probably too. The European Championships are there's a lot of teams that don't even compete in them during the 60s either. So it's not quite as big an event. So if you win, let's just say you win the European Championships, you automatically get the Ballon d'Or. And I think it really just increases the exposures of these players as we can see now. And obviously at that time it's strictly for European players or players who have European citizenship, even though we've got an Argentine and a guy from Mozambique winning in that period too. But absolutely, I think you're doing it on the highest stage, and it certainly had a factor in there winning the Rivera and Best. And if you look at actually like the guys who come second and third and stuff, there's definitely I think Johnston in 67 comes third, and there's more. A lot of those guys come, are in and around in the voting.
In closing, what is the lasting legacy of the first 15 years of this competition in world football history?
We talked about there, maybe is there an inevitability about it happening? We don't know if it was always going to happen. Maybe it would have been a pan kind of Latin Cup, or expansion, or you could have had British Championship or whatever, or it could have been a league. So, I think we do have to consider that it probably would have happened at some point, but we don't know for sure. So we just had the draw for the 24-25 tournament. It has assumed a place, and you could argue since the rebranding and the adjustment to Champions League, it's gone into overdrive. But I think it's the essential reason that European football is still the place to be. As you said, I live in the US like yourself, and they could throw all the money in the world at it and get rid of the salary caps. But I just don't know if you'd ever really get the top guys coming here, even the Saudi League, without that kind of pinnacle of football. It's like the glue that kind of keeps European football together, I think, and it keeps it in that spot ahead of all the other kind of potential competitors. So I think that's huge for European football, and I think all the other competitions come down from it as well. As I said, I'm an Aberdeen supporter. Last year we got to the Conference League group stages. There's teams this year from Northern Ireland and Wales who are in that competition now, and there's just such an infrastructure there that really kind of feeds European football and creates growth. And that's probably one of the biggest legacies. Obviously, we've got the clubs, Real Madrid. There is no other better example, right? I think in the book I talk about how if it had been, even 5 years earlier, maybe it's Honved who are the iconic team of Europe, or 10 years earlier, it's
Torino, the Grande
Torino, yeah,
Torino, yeah.
exactly, yeah, exactly, and or even 10 years later, it's Ajax or whoever. So they are in the sweet spot. But we've also got United and Benfica and Inter Milan, and obviously these are all big clubs within their nations. But I think it's really interesting when you look at that Super League, and I write that in the introduction, the potential Super League. So many of these clubs were dominant in this period of European football. Then I think the last part is probably the standard of the football, which I kind of mentioned. I think the game progresses. I think that's another advantage of Europe, the proximity of ideas, the consolidation, and obviously as we talked about with television, the ability for people to see this and so often and get inspiration from it. So I think definitely the standard of football progresses by virtue of this competition.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our contact information and the link to Mr. MacPhee's book are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Gavin, thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.